It was a warm summer evening in 1987 in a quiet cul-de-sac in a sleepy Minnesota town. Kids played tag on front lawns, screen doors creaked open and shut, and radios whispered soft rock from porch windows. 12-year-old Carla Jensen said she'd be home before dinner. She never came back, and no screams. No signs. No goodbye. Her bike was found tipped over near the woods. And just like that, a small town's innocence vanished into the trees. For 35 years, no one knew who took her. Until one day, DNA changed everything. The sun hung low over the Minnesota horizon that evening, casting long, amber streaks across the neighborhood lawns. In the tiny town of Windermere, where the biggest headlines came from bake sales and summer fairs, no one expected anything bad to happen. Not here. Not to someone like Carla. It was July 31st, 1987. A Friday. One of those summer nights where the heat had finally settled into something bearable, the kind of breeze that made the trees whisper softly and turned the sidewalks warm under bare feet. Carla Jensen had just turned 12 a few weeks earlier. She was the kind of girl people describe with phrases like always smiling and wise beyond her years, but really, she was just a kid. A kid who loved peanut butter sandwiches without crusts, who kept a diary under her bed, and who believed in horses and dreams and the magic of fireflies. She had a red 10-speed bike with faded handlebars and a squeaky back wheel that her dad kept promising to fix. That night, she said she was heading out for a popsicle. Her mother asked her to be home before dinner. Carla smiled, said she would, and pedaled down the driveway wearing jean shorts, a yellow tank top, and a pink scrunchie on her wrist. It was 6:41 p.m. The sun was still up, just starting to dip low enough to turn the sky soft and peach-colored. She rode with one hand on the handlebars and the other resting loosely by her side, weaving a little like she was dancing with the road. She waved to old Mr. Hanley, trimming his hedges, and called out to a friend's younger brother walking with his mom. Everything about that moment was ordinary, completely normal. That was the cruel beauty of it. The corner store was only 2 blocks away. She'd walked it, biked it, skipped it 100 times. Past the little church, through the gravel alley behind the school, around the bend where the trees grew thick. That night, Carla never made it. At 7:25 p.m., a neighbor named Luann Pierce was walking her beagle, Duke, near the wooded trail that wrapped behind the school playground. That's when she saw it. Carla's bike. It was lying on its side, just off the edge of the path, its front wheel spinning like it had just been dropped. The red paint shimmered under the fading light, and the handlebars were crooked, turned sharply, almost unnaturally. No one was around. No sounds except for the creak of insects starting their nightly chorus. Luann froze. Something didn't feel right. She called out, once, then twice, but there was no answer. Just Duke tugging at the leash, curious, sniffing toward the woods. The air suddenly felt different, heavier, as if even the trees were holding their breath. 7:45. Carla's mother had already begun to worry. Dinner was on the table. The ice in her sweet tea had melted. And Carla, who never missed dinner, who never went anywhere without saying something, wasn't home. She called the Jensen house down the street, thinking maybe Carla had gotten distracted playing with friends. No one had seen her. She called 2 more houses, and then 3. Still nothing. 8:03 p.m. She called the police. The officer who arrived was calm, kind, reassuring. Maybe she just got turned around, he said. Kids lose track of time in the summer. We'll find her. But something in Carla's mom had already shifted. A mother knows. Within an hour, patrol cars were driving slowly down neighborhood blocks, spotlighting backyards and alleyways. Carla's father was out on foot, calling her name, his voice cracking, echoing down empty streets. Neighbors joined in, some still holding dinner forks, others pulling on mismatched shoes. They searched the woods near the trail. Flashlights flickered through trees. Dogs barked in the distance. Someone found Carla's pink scrunchie near a tree stump. Someone else thought they heard a sound, maybe a cry, but it led nowhere. There were no signs of a struggle. No footprints leading away. No broken branches. Just the bike, still lying there, as if Carla had evaporated into the AIR.B. By 10:15 p.m., a full search was underway. A chopper flew overhead. Bloodhounds were brought in. The trail was roped off, but the dogs couldn't find a scent past the bike. Nothing to follow. Nothing to hold on to. The hours stretched into midnight. The air turned cooler, and the crowd of searchers grew quieter. People clung to hope, but it was laced with fear now. The kind of fear that doesn't speak out loud. And somewhere, maybe not too far away, someone knew exactly what had happened. Someone who had watched, waited, acted in that moment. Windermere changed, and Carla Jensen was no longer just a kid riding her bike on a summer night. She had become the center of a mystery that would haunt the town for decades. When the sun rose the next morning, the town of Windermere was already awake. The streets that were normally empty at 6 a.m. were alive with murmurs, hushed voices, worried glances exchanged between neighbors still in pajamas and yesterday's shirts. The coffee in most homes went untouched. No one was really hungry. Carla Jensen hadn't come home. By then. Her name was on every pair of lips. Posters hadn't been printed yet, but people already knew. They remembered the girl with the ponytail and bright eyes, the kid who helped carry him books on Sundays and always said thank you to the lunch ladies. 12 years old, friendly, trusting, gone. Inside the Jensen home, time had begun to collapse. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, staring at Carla's untouched dinner plate from the night before. Mac and cheese with cut-up hot dogs, a folded napkin, a glass of milk that had long since gone warm. Every so often, she would get up and go to the window, pressing her hand against the glass, squinting like she expected Carla to ride up any second on her bike with some wild excuse. Her father didn't sit. He paced. First the living room, then the hallway, then the porch. His knuckles were raw from gripping the steering wheel all night as he drove up and down back roads. Gravel crunching under tires, headlights sweeping empty fields. The silence on the police radio was louder than anything he'd ever heard. Detectives arrived just after dawn. They brought notepads and calm, professional voices, but they didn't have answers. They asked the same questions over and over. When did you last see her? Was she acting strange? Could she have run away? Carla's mother bristled. She knew her daughter. Carla wouldn't run. Not without saying something. Not without her diary or her stuffed raccoon. The one she still slept with when she thought no one knew. Officers combed through the house, looking for anything out of place. Nothing was missing. Carla's backpack was still in the corner, half unzipped. Her shoes by the back door. On her desk, a homework sheet with neat handwriting and a doodle of a cat in the margins. There was no hint, no sign, no goodbye note. She'd left like she always did, expecting to come back. Outside, the search expanded. Volunteers showed up with bottled water and maps. They walked in lines through cornfields, checked behind sheds under porches. Some brought their own dogs. Others brought walkie-talkies. They called out her name over and over again until the syllables started to lose meaning. Carla, Carla, Carla. The woods were combed 3 times. Then again, a few pieces of clothing were found, but none were hers. People swore they saw something, a flash of yellow, a shadow in the distance, but every lead ended with nothing. Just more trees, more air, more stillness. Reporters arrived by mid-afternoon, vans parking crookedly along the curb. They carried large cameras and too many questions. They knocked on the Jensen's door. They hovered near the police line, asking the neighbors what kind of girl she was, how something like this could happen here. Some of them tried to be gentle. Others weren't. By sunset, the porch was filled with flowers. Notes written in children's handwriting. Drawings of Carla with angel wings. A teddy bear with a ribbon around its neck that said, "Come home soon." But inside the house, hope was starting to thin. That night, Carla's bed remained untouched. Her room still smelled like her strawberry shampoo. Her stuffed animals were all where she left them, lined up in a lopsided row. Her mother stood in the doorway for a long time, one hand on the frame, the other clutching the pink scrunchie someone had found by the trail. She hadn't cried yet. Not really. Tears came in bursts, but then dried just as fast. There was something worse than crying. It was the not knowing, the not being able to cry, because part of her still thought she might hear the front door creak open any moment. That Carla might come in and say she got lost or scared or chased by a dog and hid in a tree. That she was okay, but the silence stretched too long, and the hours grew heavier.
By day 3, the search began to shrink. Not because people stopped caring, but because there was nothing new to search. Every barn, ditch, field, creek, and alley had been scoured. The town had flipped itself inside out and come up empty. That was when fear became something else. Something colder. Something heavier. People started locking their doors in broad daylight. Children were kept inside. Parents whispered warnings over dinner tables and school board meetings. And beneath it all was the question no one dared say out loud. What if Carla wasn't coming back? At the edge of town, just beyond the cornfields, a billboard stood over the highway. It was blank for years, an old relic waiting for a new ad. That week, someone painted it with a message. Missing Carla Jensen. Age 12. Last seen July 31st. Bring her home. No one said who did it. But it stayed up for years, because Windermere wasn't ready to forget. Time didn't just move on, it limped. The summer that Carla disappeared ended in silence. School resumed that fall, but nothing felt normal. Her empty desk sat untouched for weeks. The teacher never removed her name tag. At first, they said it was just in case. But eventually, the words stopped making sense. Just in case became too painful to believe in. The kids in Carla's class didn't know what to say. Some whispered theories behind their hands. Others stayed quiet, too scared to even guess. One girl, Ellie Raymond, started bringing an extra juice box every day and putting it on Carla's desk before the bell rang. She did it for almost a month. No one stopped her. The town of Windermere learned to live with a wound that never closed. Carla's name became sacred, spoken with lowered voices, printed on church bulletins, carried like a prayer. The police kept the case open, but they had no leads, no evidence, and no suspect. No one had seen anything. No one heard a scream. The bike had been wiped clean of fingerprints. And the trail near the school had no cameras, no houses facing it, no good angles for answers. Just shadows. Detective Roy Madsen took the case personally. A gruff, middle-aged man with thinning hair and a drawer full of unfinished case files, he had promised the Jensens he wouldn't stop. And he didn't. For years, he followed every tip. Every out-of-place detail. He tracked down drifters who passed through town. He chased a rumor about a man with a van spotted 3 towns over. He pulled old yearbooks, searching for anyone who'd once had a grudge or obsession with Carla's family. But every road led nowhere. The truth was, no one hated Carla. She was too kind, too small, too innocent. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She didn't run in the wrong crowd. There was no secret boyfriend, no dark diary entries, no pattern of rebellion. She was a child. A child who rode her bike and never made it home. Carla's mother eventually stopped sleeping in her own bed. She moved to the couch, where she'd sleep with the porch light on. Every night. Even when the bulbs burned out in the storm. Even in winter, when snow covered the steps in silence. The light stayed on. Her father changed, too. He grew quieter. More withdrawn. He started going to work earlier and coming home later, filling the spaces with things that didn't hurt. He stopped coaching Little League. He stopped fixing up Carla's bike. It stayed leaned against the back of the garage, untouched, the same way it looked the night she vanished. For the first 5 years, they still held a vigil every July 31st. The whole town would show up, candles in hand, voices low. Some years, someone would bring a song. Other years, there would just be silence. One year, the local pastor read a letter Carla had written in 3rd grade about wanting to be a vet. People wept. But time, even when it hurts, doesn't stop. The vigils became smaller. The posters yellowed. The local news stopped calling. New families moved into Windermere who only knew the story secondhand. A few residents even started calling it the old case, when they spoke of it, like it was an echo, not a wound. But Carla's mother never stopped waiting. She kept her daughter's room exactly as it had been. She vacuumed the carpet, dusted the shelves, replaced the batteries in the bedside clock, even though no one was there to check the time. Every now and then, she would sit on the edge of the bed, tracing her fingers over Carla's pillow, remembering the way her daughter laughed when she told bad jokes. Remembering how she used to sing in the bathtub, just a little off-key, and every birthday, she made a cake. Always the same kind, chocolate with vanilla frosting and red sprinkles. Carla's favorite. She would set a single plate at the table and place the first slice in front of it. Then she'd sit and wait. And remember, Detective Madsen retired in 1998. He left behind a thick, overstuffed case file labeled Jensen, Carla, bold, black letters across the spine. He handed it off to a new detective, younger, sharper, full of fresh energy and modern tools. But even she couldn't find anything new. The case was cold. Frozen in place. People don't like to admit how easily children can vanish. How even in quiet towns, with good families and watchful neighbors, a child can disappear in the space between one street light and the next. Carla's case became a ghost story parents told their kids to make them stay close. Don't go into the woods alone, they'd say. Remember Carla. But beneath that warning was something deeper. Something terrifying. Because the real horror wasn't that Carla was taken. It was that whoever took her had never been found, and might still be out there. In the years that followed, Carla Jensen's case never truly left the town. It lingered like a splinter under the skin. People moved on the way people do when they have no choice, but the unease never quite faded. Even decades later, those who had been there remembered exactly where they were when they heard she'd gone missing. They remembered the silence that settled over Windermere like a fog. They remembered the way her name had tasted when they first spoke it out loud in the past tense. By 2011, the case file had been moved to a metal cabinet in the county archives, marked inactive, not closed. Just sleeping. It might have stayed there forever, buried under years of dust and heartbreak, if it weren't for a chance decision. One that no one could have predicted. That spring, the Windermere Police Department received a small grant from the state, a funding bump meant to help local departments reevaluate cold cases using newer forensic technologies. Nothing flashy. Just a way to scan old evidence, test fibers, reprocess prints. Most departments used the money to double-check cases with obvious leads. But in Windermere, Detective Joanna Reese had other plans. Joanna wasn't from Windermere. She transferred in 5 years earlier, a former city cop looking for quieter ground after her partner died in the line of duty. But quiet didn't mean blind. She'd always had a file on her desk labeled Carla Jensen, even when no one asked her to. Some nights, she read through the case again just to remind herself that answers don't always come quickly or cleanly. She took a risk. Using a portion of the grant, she submitted the clothes Carla had worn that day to a new private lab out of state, one specializing in touch DNA. It was technology that didn't exist back in 1987. Technology that, even 5 years earlier, would have been useless. But things had changed. It took months. By the time the results came back, the air had already turned colder again. Late September. The leaves around Windermere were starting to curl, yellow and brown. Halloween decorations were going up on porches. No one was thinking about Carla anymore, until Joanna opened the envelope. Inside was a single line that changed everything. A male DNA profile had been recovered. It wasn't complete, but it was strong enough. It had been found in the waistband of Carla's shorts. Whoever had touched her that day had left a microscopic trace. Joanna sat alone in the office when she read it. The air was thick. Her hands trembled, not out of fear, but out of reverence. This was something. After all this time, they finally had a thread. Thin as a whisper. But real. She uploaded the profile into CODIS, the National DNA Database, and waited. The response came less than 2 weeks later. There was a match, not a direct hit, but a familiar one. The profile was linked to someone who never lived in Windermere. A man from Oregon, arrested on a minor drug charge, who had no idea his DNA would lead to a murder investigation. He wasn't the man. But he was a relative, and that meant somewhere out there, someone connected to him had touched Carla Jensen the day she disappeared. Joanna didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she reopened the case officially. She contacted the FBI for genealogical assistance, and for the first time in 24 years, someone added a new page to Carla's file. She didn't tell the Jensens right away. She wanted more. A full match. A name. The genetic genealogist assigned to the case worked fast. Within weeks, they had narrowed it down to 3 brothers. All had lived in the Midwest during the 1980s. Only one had a record that showed he'd ever been near Windermere. His name was Clarence Hobb. He had worked briefly as a maintenance subcontractor for the Windermere Unified School District. In July of 1987, records showed he had been part of a crew installing fencing around the back perimeter of the elementary school. He would have known the trail. He would have seen the kids.
Joanna's heart sank when she realized what this meant. Carla's disappearance hadn't been about a failed system or a moment of negligence. It had been opportunity. Random, cruel, and silent. Clarence Hobb had never been interviewed in the original investigation. He'd left the state in August of '87 and never returned. He'd slipped through unnoticed. But now, he was in the wind again. The only address they had for him was a trailer lot in Nebraska that had been bulldozed 3 years prior. No forwarding address. No known family contacts beyond the DNA-linked relative. It was like chasing smoke. But Joanna didn't stop. She filed federal paperwork. She put out an alert. She requested old employment records, tax documents, everything she could find. Every night, she stared at a photo of Carla taped to her desk. A little girl in a yellow shirt, smiling through missing teeth. The story was waking up. Clarence Hobb had become a ghost long before DNA ever called his name. He was one of those men who drifted, quiet, unremarkable, paper-thin in every system that should have caught him. He left no children, no marriages, no social media, no traceable bank accounts. Just a handful of scattered jobs across 4 states, all short-term, all forgettable. A man who never stayed long enough to leave a memory. But even ghosts leave shadows. Detective Joanna Reese knew that chasing someone like Clarence would take more than warrants. It would take instinct, patience, and a deep tolerance for silence. She started with the basics, old DMV records, cross-checked with trucking licenses, tax filings, arrest logs. Anything that bore his name. She found a handful of aliases. Clarence is sometimes UC Hobbs, sometimes Lenny Hobb. Once, he'd even signed into a motel under the name Reed C. It was messy, but it was something. She also found that in 1995, Clarence had been hired briefly by a freight company in Iowa. He'd worked nights loading pallets. The company had folded years ago, but the HR manager, an older man named Dennis, still remembered him. Not because Clarence was friendly, but because he wasn't. Dennis described Clarence as cold. Not angry or loud, just distant. The kind of man who kept his head down and avoided eye contact. Dennis remembered that Clarence always wore gloves, even in July, and he always declined rides from coworkers. Something about him felt hollow, Dennis had said. Joanna pieced the timeline together. Clarence had been in Windermere in 1987, left weeks after Carla vanished, resurfaced in Iowa 8 years later under a new version of his name. No connection to family, no fixed address. A vanishing man. But something was changing. The DNA match had triggered a new kind of interest, one that quietly rippled across law enforcement networks. The FBI was watching. So was the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Joanna received calls from agents she'd never worked with before. They were asking the same question she was thinking. What if Carla wasn't his only victim? The horrifying possibility hung in the air like a thick fog. Because men like Clarence didn't just stop. Joanna requested permission to follow up with other cold cases in towns where Clarence had once lived or worked. She built a map, plotted it with pins. From Minnesota to Kansas, from Nebraska to Indiana. Tiny towns, quiet counties, girls who had disappeared from parks, from schoolyards, from grocery store parking lots. Some are never found. Some are found too late. All of them shared eerie similarities. Point one in particular hit Joanna hard. A 10-year-old girl named Emily Dawes, missing from Osceola, Iowa in 1996. Emily had vanished during daylight, just 2 blocks from her home. Her body was found 3 days later, in a field behind an abandoned barn. The case had gone cold after a single suspect, her mother's ex-boyfriend, was cleared. Joanna looked at the crime scene photos from that case. And as she stared at the aerial layout of the barn and field, a chill crept down her spine. It was almost identical to the trail behind Windermere Elementary. Secluded, shielded from the road. No cameras. She sent Emily's evidence back through the same lab that had processed Carla's clothing. Weeks passed. She barely slept. She didn't tell anyone, not even the Jensens. Then the call came. Touch DNA. Found beneath one of Emily's fingernails that IT matched the same partial profile from Carla's case. That was the moment the story broke open. Now it wasn't just Windermere's grief anymore. It wasn't a local tragedy buried in a dusty file. It was a pattern. Clarence Hobb, whoever he was now, was likely a serial predator. One who'd slipped through decades without ever facing a consequence. The FBI moved in. They created a task force. A behavioral analyst flew in from Quantico. They dug deeper into the trail Clarence had left behind. The receipts, the job sites, the towns where women and girls had gone missing. Every new detail painted the same picture. A man who knew how to vanish, but time had finally caught up to him. The search was now national. And Joanna had one goal: bring him alive. Not for revenge, for Carla. For Emily. For the families that never got answers. But also because closure matters, even if it arrives decades late. Meanwhile, back in Windermere, Carla's mother was starting to feel something she hadn't let herself feel in 24 years. Not hope, but something close to the sharpness in her chest when the phone rang. A trembling in her hands when the news played. there were still no headlines. No arrests. But somewhere out there, the man who had taken her daughter was running out of places to hide, and she could feel it, like the way you feel the shift in the air before a storm. The cold came early that year. By the time November settled over Windmere, frost coated the mailboxes by dawn, and the town's breath lingered in the air like ghosts. Inside her office, Detective Joanna Reese kept the thermostat just high enough to keep her fingers moving. Most days she forgot to eat. She barely remembered to sleep. But the momentum was building now, and she couldn't afford to slow down. That a few weeks before Thanksgiving, she got the call she had been waiting for. The FBI had tracked Clarence Hobbs' trail to a remote parcel of land outside Helena, Montana. It wasn't listed under his name. It wasn't listed under anyone's, really. The deed belonged to a shell company tied to an old business Clarence had once worked for, long since defunct. But a surveillance drone caught something unusual. A smoke trail, a clothesline, a figure moving between trees. They had found him. After 24 years, 2 confirmed victims, and a life lived entirely in the shadows. Clarence Hobbs was alive, and he was living off-grid in the mountains. Joanna stared at the report, heart pounding. He hadn't disappeared because he couldn't be found. He had disappeared because he had mastered how to be invisible. The task force was activated. A plan was drawn. They had one shot. The area was treacherous, dense pines, uneven elevation, unpredictable winter storms. If Clarence got wind of them too soon, he could vanish again into the forest. Or worse, he could destroy evidence. Or hurt someone else. Joanna wasn't supposed to be there for the takedown. She was a state detective, and the operation was federal now. But she asked anyway, and they let her come. She didn't wear a vest. She didn't carry a weapon. She just stood in the trees, 20 yards back from the perimeter, watching the cabin through a pair of binoculars as morning broke. The sky was a pale steel. Snow was beginning to flurry sideways. The team moved in silence. A precise circle. Radios low, eyes sharp. Clarence didn't resist. When they entered the cabin, he was sitting at a makeshift desk, flipping through a yellowed notebook. He looked older than anyone expected. Gaunt, long white beard, hands cracked from cold and calloused from work. But his eyes were alert, empty, like he had been waiting for this. Joanna watched from the tree line as they let him out in cuffs. He didn't look back. Not once at the station. He said nothing. Not a word during booking. Not a protest during the interview. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't deny a thing. But he also didn't confess that it was like he'd made peace with his story ending in a cell. As if it had always been meant to end there. Joanna sat across from him once. Just the two of them. A final attempt to draw out a truth the records couldn't reach. The room was quiet. He didn't blink. And when she asked him if he remembered Carla Jensen, he finally spoke. Not in denial. Not in fear, just one word. Which one? Joanna's stomach turned. She stood up. That was enough. That DNA later confirmed his presence on Carla's clothing, on Emily Dawes' fingernails, and in trace amounts recovered from 2 other reopened cases from Indiana and Kansas. None of the victims had ever met each other. None of them had ever known Clarence Hobbs. They were simply chosen. Clarence was never charged with murder in all of those cases. Some lacked physical remains. Others lacked jurisdictional reach. But Carla's case was different. Because Windmere had never stopped looking to in the spring of the following year. Clarence Hobbs was formally indicted in the state of Minnesota for the kidnapping and murder of Carla Jensen. The courtroom was silent as the charges were read. Reporters stood outside. Neighbors who once remembered Carla only as a photograph now remembered her as a little girl whose voice had finally been heard. That Carla's parents were there, seated in the front row. Her mother held a folded piece of yellow paper, one of Carla's old drawings. It was sun-faded and soft at the edges. A stick figure with bright hair. a sun in the corner, a crooked tree. Justice hadn't come fast.
But it had come. After 24 years, the ghost was finally real, and his silence could no longer protect him. The trial began on a Monday. It was one of those rare, bitter spring mornings when the trees still hadn't decided whether they trusted the warmth. The sky above Windmere was pale and colorless, like a sheet of old paper. Inside the courthouse, the air was tighter. No one spoke above a whisper. And when Clarence Hobb entered, flanked by 2 officers, every camera lens in the room clicked at once. He didn't look up. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He simply walked to the defendant's chair, sat down, and folded his hands in his lap. Like he was waiting for a train. For many in the room, this wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning. Carla Jensen's name was spoken aloud for the first time in court in over 2 decades. And when the prosecution opened, they didn't start with DNA. They didn't start with science. They started with Carla, the girl who drew dogs with triangle ears and sang in the grocery store aisle. The girl who wanted a swing set of her own. The one who disappeared on her walk home because evil had been watching her from the shadows. Joanna Reese sat in the 3rd row, hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles had turned pale. She had worked hundreds of cases. She had seen trials before. But this was different. This was personal. The prosecution moved slowly, methodically. They brought in DNA experts, criminal analysts, even a forensic genealogist who explained how a discarded soda can from a Montana cabin had become the final nail in the case. Carla's old clothes, carefully preserved for decades, were presented to the jury in clear evidence bags. The presence of Clarence's DNA, microscopic but indisputable, was laid out in charts and slides. There were gasps when it was revealed that the same trace appeared under the fingernails of other children across multiple states. Still, Clarence didn't speak. His defense attorney attempted to sow doubt, claimed contamination, suggested police incompetence, brought up the age of the case, the time lapse, the gaps in chain of custody. But it didn't land. The room could feel it. This man was not a victim of a clerical error. He was a blueprint of something darker. A man who had lived in the cracks of the world, hiding in plain sight. Then came the day no one in Windmere could have truly prepared for. Carla's mother took the stand. She walked up slowly, her back just a little hunched, the weight of 24 years pressing down on her shoulders. She wore a gray sweater and no makeup. When she sat down, the court went still. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She spoke with the calm of someone who had learned how to hold a storm inside her chest. She told the jury what it was like to wait every day for a knock that never came. How birthdays turned into silent dinners. How she sometimes found herself setting an extra plate at the table, just out of habit, and then she said something no one forgot. "I'm not here to ask you for justice," she said, "because justice would be getting my daughter back. That's not possible. I'm here to ask you for the truth. And the truth is sitting right there." She pointed to Clarence. He didn't move, but his eyes blinked, just once. That was the closest he came to acknowledgement. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, no one breathed. Guilty. On all counts. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no cheering. Just the kind of silence that follows something sacred. The kind of quiet that says, finally. Clarence was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. But for most in Windmere, the sentence wasn't the climax. It was the sigh, the letting go. Outside, the sun had finally broken through the clouds. It poured across the courthouse steps like something had been lifted, not erased, but softened. That night, Joanna drove past Windmere Elementary. She hadn't been by in months. The old swing set was still there. Rusted. Empty. The field behind it looked smaller than she remembered. She got out of her car, walked to the fence, and for a moment she thought she heard singing, faint a little off-key, just the wind moving through the grass. But still, she listened, because even in a story like this, something always lingers. The last time Joanna visited Carla Jensen's old house, it was early summer. The grass had grown high around the mailbox. The siding was chipped in places, but the windows were clean, and the porch swing still creaked softly in the breeze. Carla's parents didn't live there anymore. They had moved 2 towns over after the trial, hoping for a quieter place, somewhere they could breathe. But the house hadn't been sold. It stood still, like a time capsule nobody wanted to break open. Joanna parked across the street and sat in her car for a long time. The engine ticked as it cooled, and she watched the curtains flutter gently in the window that used to be Carla's room. This case had taken more than 2 decades to resolve. But even now, with Clarence Hobb behind bars, something about it still clung to her. Not just the details, not just the horror, but the fact that a man could hide so well. That someone so dangerous could walk through a neighborhood, smile at children, nod to mothers, and disappear without leaving a trace. But he did leave traces. Joanna thought about that. Every monster thinks he's invisible until science proves otherwise. Without that soda can in Montana. Without the DNA on Carla's jacket. Without the quiet, obsessive work of forensic genealogists and cold case units and one persistent detective, Clarence would still be sitting in his forest cabin, watching, and somewhere another child's story would be rewritten before it was ever lived. Joanna stepped out of her car and crossed the street. She walked up the steps of the Jensen home and sat on the swing. It groaned under her weight. The air smelled like lilacs and fresh dirt. The sun had started to dip, casting gold across the lawn. It was quiet. But not the kind of silence that hurt anymore. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the item she'd carried with her since the trial. A laminated copy of Carla's drawing. The one with the stick figure girl, the crooked tree, and the sun with too many rays. She held it gently in her hands, not as evidence, not as proof, but as a reminder that every name on a case file is a real person, that every cold case is a heartbeat waiting to be heard again. She didn't stay long. Just enough to say goodbye in her own quiet way. When she stood to leave, a breeze picked up the edge of the drawing and lifted it just slightly before she pressed it back down. Somewhere behind her, a screen door slammed a few houses away. A dog barked. The world kept moving, but Windmere had changed. Not because evil had visited once, but because the town had refused to forget. Joanna climbed back into her car and started the engine. The tires crunched slowly over the gravel as she pulled away. She didn't look in the rearview mirror. She didn't have to, because Carla Jensen wasn't lost anymore. She had been found. And now, she was home. For decades, Carla's parents left the porch light on every night, even as their hair turned gray. Even as hope thinned. They believed someone, somewhere, would tell the truth. And science finally did. In the end, it wasn't a confession. It wasn't a tip-off. It was a microscopic trace left behind by someone who thought he'd never be caught. We remember Carla not for the day she vanished, but for the day her story was finally told. If this story moved you, boss, subscribe for more truth brought back from silence.